Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our tutorial series. This is Emilio, and in our previous video, we walked through creating a customer self-service app using Glide. If you haven't seen that video yet, I highly recommend going back, watching it, to learn how to build the customer self-service portal we'll be enhancing today. So to recap, Glide is a powerful no-code platform that allows you to create apps from Google Sheets or Excel files. It provides an intuitive interface to design and build fully functional mobile and web apps without writing any code. Today, we'll be integrating our Glide app with Salesforce Service Cloud using Make. Make.com is an automated platform that connects your apps and automates workflows. It allows you to create powerful integrations without writing any code, streamlining your processes, and improving efficiency. Now, integrating Glide with Salesforce using Make offers numerous benefits and ensures that your customer data is synchronized between systems, reducing manual data entry and risk of errors. Its seamless integration enhances your team's productivity and provides your customers with a consistent and efficient service experience. Before we dive in, I'd like to note that as of this recording, I'm not affiliated with Glide or Make, and thoughts and opinions in this video are my own and intended for educational purposes only. So let's begin by customizing our Glide app. And before we do so, let's jump into a quick design to give you an idea of what we're going to be doing today. So in this design, you'll see that it's very similar to the design we previously had, but what's different is that in this instance, we've got some changes we've made to both cases and notes. So on the top, we have our Glide app. We have a table for users, cases, and notes and comments. And in the fields, we had the subject, description, user ID, and row ID fields on cases. We're going to be adding a Salesforce ID field to that table. And similarly, on cases and notes, we also will add a Salesforce ID field here as well. And the reason we'll do this is because when we create a case inside of Salesforce using this integration, we want that ID to be stored back in Glide in case we want to update those records in the future. We have a tie back to the record that's in Salesforce that can make these two records sync behind the scenes. And below you can see that we've got a bi-directional integration, meaning if I pass data from Glide into Salesforce, Salesforce will send values back to me, which will be the Salesforce ID. And for the notes, we just have a one-way integration, meaning every time I create a note in Glide, it's going to send those notes to case comments inside of Salesforce, but it's only going to go into Salesforce. It won't go back. So now we have a better understanding of how we're going to design this. Let's jump into Glide. And in the data section, we'll add a new field to our cases table. Let's call this Salesforce ID. As you can see, we've added this here. And this is just a regular text field. And this will store the Salesforce case ID, as you can see. And if we click on notes, we'll see the same thing where we have our Salesforce ID linked here. Now, let's switch over to Make and let's look at the scenario. So in order to integrate Glide and Salesforce, we'll see a number of components listed here. First, we'll select the Watch New Action option inside of Make. And what that does is it will create a webhook for us. And this URL will be provided for us. A webhook is essentially an address or an endpoint for an API that allows us to send data from one system and take that endpoint and bundle a series of other fields. Like in this case, we have both cases and notes that we want to have an endpoint tied to us passing data from one system to the other. And this webhook allows us to do that. So we're going to copy this address to the clipboard, just so we have a copy of it because we'll use that later on. And the next step of this scenario, we have a router. What this router is essentially doing is we can take that one action from Glide and we can route different scenarios or different integration points from one center point. So in this case, Glide will talk to Make, and in this router, it's going to say in one situation, I have some data that's going to be a case, route that to the cases record in Salesforce. And then I have another route that will create notes for those cases inside of Salesforce. And additionally, at the end of that step, so we can open up the connection here, and we can see that when we have our Salesforce connection made, we can map that to the case record. The only fields you really need in this scenario are business hours ID, and we map in the subject, the description. And there's one additional field that we'll need to create in Salesforce called external ID. I'll show you how to do that in a second. And then in addition to that, we have for our Salesforce case comments, we have the parent ID, which would be the Salesforce ID of the case that we're looking at, and the comment. Now, the way that this router would work is, say I have data coming in from Glide that is going to be a case. How will it know the difference between a note and a case? So on the router, this is where you have this filter. And on this filter, it'll show us, I've set up a condition where the record type is equal to case and the sync type is equal to create. And we'll show this in Glide in a second of how you can trigger this, how when you're setting up your webhook, how you'll be able to create this sort of structure inside of your webhook data. And that way you can have your request include these values like record type and sync type. And the same thing goes for creating a new note. So here I have the record type as note, sync type as create. So this will allow for, as a new record getting passed from Glide into Make, to be able to route the data where one situation it goes to create a new case, another situation creates a new note, and one extension from the case route is at the end of this, when I go to create this new record in Salesforce, this new case, I actually want to come back and update my customer service app on my cases table, and I want to map in the row ID of that particular case, and then I want to update it with the Salesforce ID. So this is how you get that bi-directional integration that we saw earlier, where when I go from Glide, it routes through Make, and then it will go into Salesforce and create a record. I want to store that Salesforce ID for later use, and that's how that actually works here. So now let's run through a really simple scenario where I've got this scenario open and I want to run this now and actually create a case and create a note so you can see how this works. So we'll choose run once. We'll wait for some new data. So now it's sitting here waiting. Let's go into our Glide app, go to layout, and here you want to go ahead and create a new case. New case for video. We need help with our password. Go ahead and submit this. So now our case has been created. We'll see this case here, and we'll see that inside of Glide, it captured that action. You can see that the information here for our new case, our row ID, you can see the record type is case, sync type is create. You can also see that it passed through this route because it met that filter. You can also see here that it went ahead and created a new case, and it has a ID that Salesforce passed back to us. And then we can come back here and it's gone back into Glide and it's updated that record with the Salesforce ID. So if you want to make sure that works properly, then you can come here and you can actually see that we have the record that we submitted and the actual Salesforce value that got passed in here as well. So now let's do one more test. So we've got our case that we've created, and let's also double check one more thing. So we know that the case ended up in Salesforce. We're now in Salesforce Sales Cloud. Let's go and switch over to Service Cloud by going to cases, and you can actually see the case is now here inside of Salesforce. And you can see the information we passed in. You can see the external ID that was passed in as well. And here we've got the values we passed into Salesforce. Now, if you're not sure how to actually create that external ID field inside of Salesforce, what we'll do is we'll go to the setup and we'll choose Object Manager, and we'll choose Case here and Fields and Relationships. And as you scroll down here, this is where we'll have a custom field that we've mapped in. So we can create that custom field just by going to Fields and Relationships, selecting New, and then here we will choose, in this case, it will be a regular text field. We'll choose Next. We'll say external ID 2. The length will be, in this case, 120 characters. And that's where we check our checkbox for external ID. So you can create a number of these, but this is the best way for you to be able to pass data into Salesforce, into any object. You'll need an external ID. And you really want to do this so that you can keep referential integrity between one system and the other. And it allows for you to be able to know that whenever I sync data from one system outside of Salesforce coming into it, I have an ID reference from that outside system. So because we've already created this field, we don't need to create it again, but you can choose Next, take you through the prompts, and that'll add that field for you. We'll cancel this here. And so now we can see that that case was created. Let's go back into Glide and let's open up that new case and let's add a new note for that case. So before we run through this, now we're going to run once again and wait for data. It's going to sit here. And now we'll choose adding a note, new note for video, case, read, password, help, and we'll submit it. So now we have this new note added for this case. And so now we'll go into make, and you'll see that in this instance, we do have the record came in. You can see that the record type was note. We have the create sync type and the Salesforce ID. So you'll see why that was important for us to add that step at the end, is because we're using it in the sequence of adding notes or any other records related to that case. You need to have that value stored as well so that you can use it later on. So we can see that it hit this route, and because it met the criteria for being a note and the create, it met both of those criteria. It then was able to go ahead and create a case comment, and that is the record ID from that. So now if we go into Salesforce and we go into our feed, so we go into our details here, we'll just refresh this record. And you now have the new note added directly into that Salesforce case. Now, the last thing we want to do is we want to understand, how did that data get from Glide into Make to pass in through that integration? How do we create that structure to be able to trigger that webhook? So remember, on that first step, we have the Glide watch new action, where it gives us a webhook that we can use. So when you copy this address to your clipboard, the way that you make this work is if I go back to my cases and I click on the plus icon, you'll see that it opens up the form. Over on the right-hand side, you'll see on submit, and on submit, you'll select trigger webhook. And that's where we'll paste in the URL that Make gives to us here. And then as you see here, we've got our subject, our description, our row ID, record type, and sync type. This is how you create the body of that request. So this is how you'll be able to map in any values that you need to. As you can see, some data is coming directly from the case record, and other ones are mapped in just as a string. Always remember, if you're passing data to another system, you always want to make sure we have double quotes here so that it knows it's a string. And the other thing is, once you've got this mapped in, then you can be able to test that. So in this scenario, after creating this structure, one of the things that I actually had to do a number of times was create this first component, create the router, and then create the rules for the routers as well. So I wasn't able to map in the Salesforce connections yet until I was able to prove I could run through the webhook and the router so it met the conditions. Otherwise, the Salesforce components would give you an error because some of the data may not have been mapped already. So what I would suggest is create this in stages. select your watch next action first, create your router, and then start to create your rules, and then run this without Salesforce and the Glide connections separately. Make sure that the data passes at least to these second and third steps. Once the data is getting to this step successfully, then you can add on the Salesforce creator record for these two, and it'll work just fine. But build it out in stages, because if you try to connect all of this all at once, you'll get errors when these sections are not quite there yet, especially when you're trying to route data in and you're testing out your mappings. The next thing is the same thing that we do for our case, we have to do for our notes. So we'll open this up, and on notes, and we'll go to general. You'll see a very similar setup. So on submit, I've got my trigger webhook. I pasted in the URL. So you notice it's the same webhook we used as before. The difference is on this, I've got my comments, I've got my note, I've got my sync type, and my Salesforce ID. So this allows for us to then pass in the Salesforce value that we received from the previous case on to that new case comment that we're adding in the system. So as you can see, this is a very flexible system. And as you have more values, as you add more custom fields, you'll be able to capture more information and sync those with Salesforce. It's also great about this design. It's loosely coupled in the sense that you can have your self-service portal be expansive while you keep Salesforce fairly rigid, especially if you need to have a customer service team working within the system. You can offer more features and more access to information through your self-service portal without necessarily needing to change Salesforce that much to get it to work. And now that you've run through this scenario, you're now integrated. Your Salesforce customer self-service app in Glide and Salesforce Service Cloud using Make now make all of these systems tie together. In our next video, we'll explore how to use AI and consulting internal SOPs to immediately answer some customer requests and reduce the number of trivial cases that your support team might need to handle. So I hope that this content was helpful. Please like, comment, share, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for more tutorials and tips. And thank you for watching.